Yeah. Okay.
I
I'm very excited. Is Prof. Noakes your main speaker today?
Yes, he is my main speaker, and that is the reason I really wanted you to introduce him, because the kind of the kind of words which you could generate about him would be, so much helpful, considering that you've been a part of the whole journey since the very beginning. So I think it's really kind of you to, take out this time and introduce him. And uh, I am pretty much nervous. Pratik knows that. It's indeed, quite a big moment for me.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. And also people who have a natural, healthy respect for him. It gladdens my heart because, for the past 5 years, I've been dealing with doctors and academics who have been incredibly unprofessional and unkind to him. And they make me even more defensive, which
Absolutely.
is not really my role as a journalist, but I also, when I see injustice, I just feel I have to do something about it.
Absolutely.
There's an old quote, Eli Wiesel said, silence only favors the oppressor. It doesn't favor the oppressed. So when you see something bad, say something,
Absolutely. And yes, Professor Noakes is here. Oh my goodness. All nerves here. I'm Professor Noakes. It's so much of a pleasure to have you here with me. And I'm tremendously nervous, as Marika knows. And Marika, it's just
That's
that,
right.
it's just that
Hi, Marika.
I'm trying to, really do, interview as an Indian culture, Professor Noakes. It's like our guru is something who is, really we feel so much about our guru, and and all the sayings in Buddhism as well, that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And you came into my life at the time when I was struggling with running, I was struggling with my own health, I was struggling with various issues, and I was just wanting to know what is and where is everything going wrong. And so it is then when you entered my life, and of course then I made that connect with Marika, and it's just so wonderful to have both of you here today with me. And Marika, you are my role model of fighting injustice. I think
Wow.
I am trying to do the same. I'm trying to challenge people to change the conventional dietary beliefs, to at least try to unlearn and relearn, at least try to put in that effort. And so I would not say anything more. And Professor Noakes, it is my great honor to have you here with me today. And Marika, would you please do the honor of introducing Professor Noakes to everybody who is hearing us today, and for whenever this whole session I will be making live.
Thank you. So for any of your listeners and viewers who don't know me, I'm a South African investigative and health and medical journalist. And it's my great pleasure and privilege today to introduce Professor Tim Noakes. He's a medical doctor and an emeritus professor at his alma mater, the University of Cape Town. He is also one of the few scientists in the world with an A1 rating for expertise in both sports science and nutrition. He's published more than 750 scientific books and articles. He's been cited more than 19,000 times in the scientific literature, and he has an H index of 71. Very difficult for most scientists to beat that. He's won numerous awards, he's on many editorial boards, and he's the author of many best-selling books. He's also, in South Africa, very well known as a pioneer of low carbohydrate, high healthy fat, I'll call it LCHF, and ketogenic diets to treat and prevent life-threatening chronic diseases. Chief among those, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and heart disease, but also many more. Professor Noakes, as I've come to understand, has a very well-developed habit of challenging medical orthodoxy and dangerous dietary dogma. And like all of those brave enough to do that, he's paid a very heavy price. In 2015, he became the first scientist, probably in the world ever, to be prosecuted and persecuted, as his legal team said, simply for his evidence-based opinions on diet and nutrition. And for all those listening who don't know, Professor Noakes' medical regulatory body at the time, the Health Professions Council of South Africa, that's HPCSA for short, subjected him to a multi-million rand trial over more than 4 years, all because they objected to his scientific opinions on nutrition. They trumped up a charge of unprofessional conduct. That was in response to a Johannesburg dietitian who had a business to protect. She reported him for a single tweet in February 2014. In it, he said the good first foods for babies are low-carb, high-fat. And that means meat, fish, chicken, eggs, and dairy. That aligns perfectly, as it did at the time, with international pediatric guidelines. 2 of the HPCSA's own committees eventually exonerated him completely of any wrongdoing on the charge. And that's where I came in. I'm privileged to be his co-author in a book that we've written on his trial. We first called it Law of Nutrition, Challenging Conventional Dietary Advice. We've revised it and updated it for the international market, and it's now called Real Food on Trial: How the Diet Dictators Tried to Destroy a Distinguished Scientist. And in it, we detail all the MDs, the academics and dietitians who ganged up on him over the years. They indulged in what's called academic mobbing or bullying. They tried to destroy him. They failed simply because they disagreed with his views. Excuse me. As I write in the book's closing chapter, it's really very difficult to believe that so many spent so much time trying so hard and failing miserably to destroy him. And all the evidence we give is uncontested, and it's in public record. There are many reasons why I, as a journalist, I continue to write about Professor Noakes. And it's not just because of this man's personal integrity and his really fierce intellect. It's also because he does what all good scientists do when they are confronted with compelling evidence that flatly contradicts their beliefs. And no matter how long they've held the beliefs, they go with the evidence. And I'm only willing to support scientists and doctors who go with the evidence. And in closing, Professor Noakes really is the best advert for what he preaches. He's in his 70s, he's fit and healthy, and he's still an amazing long-distance runner. He's reversed his own type 2 diabetes through major dietary change. And he's also very much multi-dimensional. He doesn't only talk about obesity and diabetes. He looks at all the medical and scientific debates of the day, no matter what discipline is involved. And these days, that includes the biggest debate that's happening, which is, COVID-19, the new coronavirus. And he applies his extensive training, his knowledge base, and his amazing intellectual rigor to this, as he does to everything in his life. It's now my privilege to hand over to Professor Noakes. And thank you, Pallavi, for making this opportunity.
Thank you. It's indeed
thank
my
you.
honor. So,
gosh, well, thanks very much, Marika. That's so kind of you. It's so funny because I've just been checking on Twitter. Someone advertised our book, and there were 2 reviews of which he drew attention to. And the one was a 5-star review, brilliant book, and the other was a 3-star review. And I looked at it and said, it's a great book. It's all true, but I don't like Noakes because he's a whinger and a whiner. So he said the book is full of Noakes' whinging and whining, and I don't think that's true. I don't think
not at all.
Yeah. So
we just all we do is document what happened, and the truth hurts a lot of people.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So it's always funny that not everyone can ever like you. That's what you have to learn in life.
Yes, absolutely. But for India today, Professor Noakes, it's a matter of great honor. And indeed, I'm so grateful for you to taking out time and coming here online with me and recording this session. Currently, India in the general Indian population and our runners, our athletes are actually sitting on a ticking time bomb of poor metabolic health. And that is the reason I wanted you to be here with me. And of course, as Marika has very correctly spoken, we are sitting on this whole Corona pandemic, and lot of I've read, I've seen a lot of tweets from you, but I would like everybody to hear from you. How is COVID linked to poor metabolic health? What is actually going on?
Thank you. That's a great question. And you know what worries me about this whole coronavirus is that we weren't told the truth, at least in South Africa. We weren't told the truth that it's a condition that strikes mainly people older age, over 80 or so, who have metabolic disease like type 2 diabetes, cancer, and hypertension, and so on. And we weren't told that. And instead, everyone was made to fear the disease. And I've got good reason to fear it because I'm over 70 and I have type 2 diabetes in remission. So potentially I'm at high risk. And I'm glad that they locked down, because that allowed me to reduce the risk that I would get the disease. And so I'm thankful for that. But I think the cost was enormous, and that's what worries me. So the reason why the virus affects us more because we have type 2 diabetes or metabolic syndrome, as I understand it, is a couple of reasons. Firstly, our blood glucose concentrations are elevated, and the virus likes to grow under those conditions. Secondly, if you have a high blood glucose concentration, you also have a high glycated hemoglobin concentration. Mm-hmm. And that means many of the proteins in your body are glycated. And it turns out that the protein with which the virus gets into the cells, that it binds to the protein, is also glycated in people with type 2 diabetes. And so the virus can more easily enter the cells of type 2 diabetic patients. And the third is obesity, and that's an inflammatory response. And so the more obese you are, the kind of the final stage of the disease, which is where the inflammation takes over and your body essentially kills you, that inflammatory response is enhanced in people who are obese. So those are some of the simple reasons. And the message is that the best vaccine against this disease is keeping healthy and making sure you stay thin and don't have metabolic syndrome. And that message is slowly coming out, but very reluctantly. And, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I think there's more to this thing than we can recognize. And I think that the media has hyped it for reasons that we don't yet understand. And it's become very politicized. And the evidence, like, for example, that vitamin D is highly protective, or in other words, low vitamin D is pretty bad for you, is hidden. And I read on Twitter a few days ago that you're not actually allowed to say that in certain communities. You're not allowed to come and say vitamin D is a risk factor and we should replace vitamin D. So that's been politicized. Hydroxychloroquine has been politicized, that if you promote hydroxychloroquine, you support a particular political party in the United States, and that's not acceptable. And so it goes on. And the stuff that the untruths that are coming out is horrendous, because my opinion is, if you sort out your metabolic syndrome, you make sure you're not vitamin D deficient, and probably if you take some minor drugs like hydroxychloroquine early on, very early on, the disease might disappear without any major consequences. But you're not allowed to say that for reasons that I don't fully understand. But anyway, the point is, for the individual, get healthy and take vitamin D is a very good start to protect yourself.
Absolutely. I absolutely and fully agree with. And most of the people, of course, in the Western population, and even in India, we are seeing most of us are becoming Indians are as well sitting on a terrible metabolic health syndrome, and most of us are vitamin D resistance because we are not stepping out in the sun. We are sitting in the comfort of our air-conditioned houses and offices, and there is zero movement in our life, and we are snacking every 2 hours. And of course, it's all about carbohydrates. It's all about garbage. And Professor Noakes, every time we are told that eat less and exercise more. And I would like to know your journey. I mean, I know it very well. I would like everybody to know about your journey being an ultra athlete. What happened? What all actually happened? Let the people know about this.
So what happened to me was that I started long distance running. I came from a rowing background, and then I started long distance running in 1973. And the idea that you should eat carbohydrate was literally just coming into vogue. It started in about 1969 when a group of Scandinavian scientists developed a technique called the muscle biopsy technique. So they would take this needle, and I don't have a copy here, a sample with me, and you'd put it in the muscle, and then you'd cut a little bit of sample out, you'd take it out, and you'd measure its carbohydrate content. And if you could do that, you were a world-class scientist in the exercise sciences. So of course, we started doing that. And the whole story, we reduced all of human exercise performance to one variable, the amount of carbohydrate in your muscles when you started the race. That was it. Nothing else mattered. Not the way you thought, your heart function, your lung function, your muscle function. It was purely how much carbohydrate you had in the muscles. And how did you fix that up? Well, you ate as much carbohydrate as you possibly could for the last 3 days. And I mean, we used to eat 600 grams, 700 grams a day for 3 days before marathons. And surprisingly, some people didn't do so well in it, but we ignored it. I mean, no, it's not part of you. You're just an outlier. So I started doing that actually only after I'd run my best races. And I only recognized that later. My best races were run when I was eating a high-fat diet. And I now know why. Because I was profoundly insulin resistant. And the only time I sorted out my metabolism was when I went and trained very long distances. So we used to go and run 40 miles on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning. And I'd feel like heaven when I got back. And the reason was I'd sorted out my metabolic problems. I was in ketosis, and now the insulin resistance was less bad. But unfortunately, I continued to eat lots of carbohydrate, and eventually, over many, many years, to slowly put on weight. My running went down, and I developed type 2 diabetes. But just by good fortune, I came across Eric Westman's book, The New Atkins for the New You. And it said, lose 6 pounds in 6 weeks without hunger. And I said, that's impossible, because we know when you cut calories, you feel hungry. I mean, I tried it 1,000 times, it never worked. And here I'd run, and the more I ran, it didn't help either, because you just get hungry and eat more, of course. We know that now. So anyway, I did this. I read the book, and within 2 hours, I said, oops, that's it. I got it wrong for 33 years. And there's one characteristic about me is I make decisions quickly on the evidence. But then, of course, I continue to assess whether the evidence is true or not. But anyway, I changed the diet, and the first week I lost 2 kilograms. So I said, and I started to feel better. And within 6 weeks, my running had improved dramatically. And I'd literally taken 20 years of my life. I'd gone back to the exact times I was running at 40, I was now running at the age of 60. And I could not believe it, because I'd had this 20 years deterioration. And suddenly, just by changing my diet, it reversed it. So then I went back and looked at old data on myself. And it turned out that when I was 29 or 30, I was profoundly insulin resistant. We did some experiments and I could find the data. And my fasting insulin was 30 units. Now that was 30 units. It's 5 times what we would like. Now we say now your value must be 6 or below. Mine was 30 because I was eating this high carbohydrate diet. Interestingly, we did a high fat experiment and I managed to drop it to about 15, but it still was grossly elevated. Importantly, my blood glucose was 4.5. My fasting glucose was fantastic. And in those days, we thought fasting glucose tells you everything. Of course it didn't. It was hiding this profound insulin resistance. So I think the sad point was that my father died of type 2 diabetes in 1992 after a 10-year battle with the disease. And dying from diabetes, there's very few worse diseases. It was terrible to watch him deteriorate because he was a very strong and powerful man. And when he died, he'd had strokes and he couldn't communicate anymore, which was tragic because we had so much to say to each other, but we couldn't. And so that was, then I realized, I've got a responsibility to try and help people realize that type 2 diabetes is a killer, but it's reversible, and you can do something about it. And this is my final statement for the time being. You don't die of diabetes, you die of the management of diabetes, and that's critical. People have to understand that.
Absolutely, absolutely, so true. And it's such an oft-repeated sentence which I keep hearing, and exactly that was what was happening to me, that I was eating less. I mean, personally, that's when, as I say, that when the student is ready, the guru appears. And I was eating a hypocaloric diet. I was trying to battle my own metabolic health, and the more I was running, the hungrier I was feeling, and the worse it was. A couple of initial times, the timings went up pretty much well, but then I was just feeling burnt out. I was feeling miserable all the time when the lower of first the running and then nutrition, and then this whole story started. And being a doctor, I think in that case, I'm a little like you, that it's just hit me. Oh my goodness, this is what's happening. That's where I'm going wrong. And yet, unfortunately, it's because we are at quite an infancy when it comes to running, and all sorts of athletes, and of course CrossFit and all of these are at a very infancy stage in India. And it's all now about the pace, the timings, and whether you're a podium finisher or not. And I remember once, maybe a year back, I had tweeted to you that well, my pace seems to have gone down, but otherwise I'm feeling good. And then I remember you tweeting back to me that whether it's your health which is more important or the pace. So if I would like you to share something to the runners who are here and who will be watching, what is the role of carbohydrates? Is there any role at any time of your training cycle, whether you are running a tempo, or you're doing a sprints, or you're doing an endurance run? Does the role of carbohydrates come in at any time, or is there just no role at all?
Well, thank you. I think it's always important to go back to the physiology and try to understand the physiology. And the problem is we don't understand the physiology. That's the bottom line. So, for example, it's impossible to measure how much fat a human is burning when they're running at a very high intensity, for various reasons which are not necessary to discuss. You have to use special novel techniques to measure exactly how much fat is being used. And there's a group of New Zealanders who are doing it at the very moment, and I've seen their initial data. And what those initial data suggest is that even at 100% of VO2 max, in other words, at close to your maximums, not full sprinting speed, but it's pretty high intensity, you can still burn plenty of fat, which contradicts all the other arguments. So what we do now, at least this is established, that up to 90% of your maximum, you can burn a lot of fat if you're fully fat adapted. And 90% of VO2 max will take you beyond the marathon. I mean, it will easily incorporate the marathon. So any distance beyond the marathon can be run completely on fat, and it will provide all the energy you require. Having said that, there are some individual variations, and so some of the world's best athletes will say, yes, Dr. Noakes, you might be right, but I still find, even though I'm fat adapted, when I'm racing a marathon, I still do need to take some carbohydrates during the race. And the question is, what is it doing? It can't be having a metabolic effect. It's probably acting in the brain as a stimulant. So I think that's, no one tends to argue with that one. If you're running more than a marathon, you can do it on fat. We've done a study and published it on 5-kilometer time trial, people running a 5-kilometer time trial in the laboratory. Now, 5-kilometer time trial, they ran at about 82-85% of maximum. And guess what? We put them for 6 weeks on a high carb diet, and then we put them 6 weeks on a high fat diet. They were randomized, so it was well controlled, and there was absolutely no difference whatsoever in performance. We actually were looking at quite good athletes, and most of them were running the 5 kilometers in under 30 minutes, under 20 minutes, which means they were running fast in 4 minutes a kilometer. We then looked at how many American runners can run at fast in 4 minutes a kilometer for 5 kilometers, and it turns out it's about 12% of the population. So therefore, our finding suggests that, if anything, only about 12% of the population should be eating carbohydrates because they might be running a bit faster. Doesn't mean they need to, but it might be. So I think that's the important point, is that the vast majority of athletes do not need the carbohydrates that we used to promote. There may be a role for carbohydrate in the very best athletes running very fast over short distances. But we don't know, because no one's really tried to take the very best athletes in the world and put them on a high-fat diet. So we don't know. But to come back to answer the question then, for more than 50% of athletes worldwide, high carbohydrate diets are not necessary and are probably and will be detrimental if you're insulin resistant. So the first question is, am I insulin resistant or not? And you can begin to test that if you're progressively putting on weight and your waist is getting fatter. That's not absolute. There are some people who will stay thin but become more insulin resistant. But if you notice that, and you notice your running times are getting worse, then you have to start testing for insulin resistance and maybe realize that the carbohydrates are more harmful. I'm just going to finish up with one little story, because this will help a lot of people. One of the greatest runners in South Africa is a guy called Bruce Fordyce, who won our 90-kilometer race 9 times, which will never be matched. It was astonishing. Now, where did he get his dietary advice from? He got it from me. And what did I tell him to do? I told him to eat a high carbohydrate diet. And we even developed a product called FRN, Fordyce, Rose, and Noakes. The 3 of us with a company developed this high carbohydrate goo that you would run and then you would squeeze in your mouth every 5 kilometers or something. And then we had buckets of the stuff that you'd eat before the race and for the 3 days before the race. And when Bruce won the 9th race, which was his final win, he was about 1.5 kilograms heavier than when he first won. And he wasn't the same runner. He was definitely not as good a runner. He was only a few minutes slower, but you could see he was not the same. He eventually converted to this diet in his late 50s, early 60s. And he said, you know, Tim, if I'd eaten this diet all my life, I would have won 12 Comrades marathons, not just 9.
Absolutely.
So that was the evidence that even for the very best athletes, high carbohydrate diets may be beneficial. And then finally, another great friend is a guy called Dave Scott, who won the first 6 Ironman triathlons in the United States. He was the man who really brought the world focus on ultra endurance exercise, because he won his first race, I think it was about 1978. And in 1978, the only people who were running ultra marathons were South Africans, but we only had like 2,000. Then along came the Ironman, and it just took off globally. And all of a sudden, you had all these people doing ultra triathlons lasting 8, 10, 12 hours. So it was a whole new field of endeavor. And Dave Scott was the single man who kind of developed the Ironman, because he won this iconic race. And then everyone wanted to do it to be like Dave Scott. And he was partially vegetarian. He was mainly vegetarian, but ate a very high carbohydrate diet. And he converted to this diet about 7 years ago. And he said to me, you know, he also said he wished he'd eaten this diet when he was winning those Ironman races on this high carbohydrate diet. He said he had real issues on the high carbohydrate diet, which have now disappeared since eating the high fat diet.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, I am nowhere near all these legendary people, but I'm just a very, very common person. But I have really seen the difference, which taking out as much as possible the carbohydrates from my life. I try to run fasted. I try not to depend on any of the sports drinks, and of course, there is a particular thing which I still feel is that where you said that the concept of the whole brain comes in, that for years our brain has been conditioned to having these glucose, those sugary sweet, whatever, whenever we are tired, whenever we are feeling hungry, or whenever we are exercising. And I experimented it on myself, that on one run, I just took along some salt solution with me, and I just added a couple of drops of stevia to make it a little sweet. And in the other run, I just took along some glucose sugary drinks, and both the runs were equally same. And when the fatigue sets in, as your central governance theory says, that when the fatigue sets in, then the brain somehow, it's that brain tongue connection, where as soon as it tastes something sweet, whether or not it's really sugar, you just feel. So I think ordinary people like us need to really work on that. I'm working pretty hard, and I'm quite weaned myself away from my brain thinking that, but it does still set in. And I wonder if you have any tips which you could share with us as to how to get this tongue and the brain connection, not doing what it keeps doing.
Yeah, that's another great question. I think that sugar is so addictive, and also the sweet replacements are also just as addictive. And so what I did was I just cut sugar, but it took me 14 months to get off the sugar. And then I'm religious. I just will not take anything sweet tasting. But then I have type 2 diabetes, so I can be motivated not to eat sweet things. But I can understand for many people, it's a problem. And I think the biggest reason why people fail to adopt the low-carb diet is because they never quite get control of that sugar addiction. And it's really interesting that we did a study of 28 people who had self-medicated themselves with this diet. And then we looked at how many of them had reversed their type 2 diabetes. And 75% had got control of their type 2 diabetes just by themselves, no doctors involved. And the key finding was that the ones who lost the addiction to sweet foods were the ones who coped. It wasn't about, in the end, it wasn't about controlling your blood glucose or your blood insulin. It was controlling your desire to eat sweet foods. That was it. And if you could do that, you could reverse your diabetes. But if you couldn't, you wouldn't reverse the diabetes, because eventually you'd fall back into eating high carbohydrate, high sugary diets.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, I think all of us have to, and I completely agree with you about artificial sweeteners as well. I've done all these experiments on myself, and the day I start, adding some artificial sweeteners, it's just by evening that whole craving comes back, and the day I'm completely off, I'm really doing well. I mean, I've done all these experiments, and I definitely discourage artificial sweeteners in most of the people who are trying to wean themselves away from a high carbohydrate diet. And I think all runners in our country, which we have to understand, unfortunately, Professor Noakes, it's become a vicious circle in India, that people are feeding carbs. People are literally eating so much of carbs at every 4 kilometers, 3 kilometers, they are having their high carbohydrate gels and the sugary sports drinks. And it scares me to think that the kind of bad effects we are all having, on other kind of metabolic ill effects we are having. And they are just, for them, it's all about the pace. Everything is about the pace, but they are not seeing, again, like Corona is an acute pandemic, and they are not seeing the kind of epidemic they are causing over their bodies. And this brings me to my next extremely important question, is this whole huge myth over cholesterol and statins. This is, oh my goodness. I mean, I belong to a doctor family. Everybody in my family is doctors. My father has been on statins since years. He refuses to accept this whole theory of cholesterol and statins. And it's just so painful to me now that I see the truth behind all of this. But I would like everybody to hear it from you in a very short. What is this whole thing about the cholesterol and the statins? And everybody on India is on statins. And we are
of course, because the pharmaceutical industry is driving it. And as someone tweeted today, I think the pharmaceutical industry is organized crime pretending to be a medical company. And that's the tragedy.
Yes.
So it's really interesting, because this morning I just finished my lectures for this Low Carb Down Under conference. And I prepared the 10 things that the diet dictators don't want you to know. And of course, I stole the diet dictators from Marika's use of that term in our book title. And I discovered, so what I did was I wrote a whole series of columns for CrossFit.org. And you can see these columns on CrossFit.org. And I would encourage people to go and look at them because it's called the Ansel Keys Cholesterol Con. And I put 9 months work into it. And I looked at 70 events, which I gleaned from the two great books by Gary Taubes and Nina Teicholz. But there were 70 events which lead up to this theory that cholesterol causes heart disease. And the 70 events are fallacious. Most of them are trying to prove the hypothesis, but I give all the evidence and show there is absolutely no evidence. So the other day I came across an interesting article by Peter Libby, who's professor of cardiology at Harvard University. And it's really interesting because I debated him in Cape Town on cholesterol and heart disease. And I thought he had to say it does cause it, and I had to say it doesn't. And at the end of the debates, the guy who'd organized the conference, came up and said, "Tim, I think you're right." And he's himself a leading cardiologist in the world, but he wouldn't say that openly. So anyway, Peter Libby publishes an article, and maybe I just have it close at hand. I don't know why I should have it. Yes, I do. And I'm so glad I've got it because I just happen to have it. And the title is The Forgotten Majority. The Forgotten Majority, Unfinished Business in Cardiovascular Risk Reduction. I honestly didn't have this at hand because I thought you were going to ask the question. Just happens to be at hand.
I'm so glad.
And here he publishes a figure, which I don't know if you can see this, but now let me go back. Epidemiology has destroyed medicine for one reason. It said that there are many reasons or causes for disease. And that's not true. For disease, there's one cause and one cause alone. And if you don't find that cause, you can't reverse the disease. There are many reasons for diseases, but there's one cause. With cardiovascular disease, there are many reasons that are advanced by epidemiologists. And we can talk about high blood pressure, cholesterol, social class, blah, 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 all these things. Those are not the cause, because if you reverse them, the disease still is present. But the most important point is what happens if you take people and put them on a statin. If cholesterol causes the disease must disappear. And that's critical. It's like if you had tuberculosis and you give an anti-tubercular drug, if it doesn't cure the disease, then the tubercular, what you're trying to treat, is not the cause. And that's the difference. Cardiology and epidemiology have confused us by coming up with risk factors instead of saying, we do not know the cause. And the answer is, we do not know the cause of heart disease. Okay. Now, in this article by Dr. Libby, he has a figure which shows the number of people who are on statins during clinical trials who develop heart attacks. Okay? These are the clinical trials that people are on statins and they have a heart attack during the trial. Now, if cholesterol causes the heart disease, the number of people who are meant to have a heart attack on statins is 0. 0. Not 1. So here's the figure. And if you look at it, you can't really see it. But the figure is, and I'll give you the figures at the top, these are average about 75% of people on statins in these trials have heart attacks while they're on statins. And that doesn't mean the other 25% are protected. It means that they die of something else, usually from cancer or other things, as you know. So therefore, cholesterol is not the cause of heart disease. Because if you treat it and you lower the cholesterol, incidentally, in that figure, the average cholesterol reduction is about 25 to 30%. So they've had a huge reduction, and yet there's very little benefit to the patients. We estimate that 1 in 100 patients who've had a heart attack will benefit from taking a statin. So the point I'm making is that the lipid hypothesis, which is cholesterol causes heart disease, is false. It's not true. There is something else. Now, in the lecture that I was preparing, I knew this, but I didn't realize its implications. Ansel Keys did 2 studies, or he was involved in 2 studies, where they looked at the relationship between diet and blood cholesterol concentrations in a population. So if I take anyone into a laboratory for 6 weeks, and I take the saturated fat out of the diet and I replace it with polyunsaturated fats, the cholesterol will fall. It'll fall a little bit. Okay, so therefore we all say, well, you see, diet determines your cholesterol. In these clinical trials, particularly the Framingham study and the 7-country study, there was no relationship, and this is critical. There was no relationship between diet and blood cholesterol concentration in the entire population. And there are about 30 other smaller studies showing exactly the same. So in the population, what determines your cholesterol is many things other than diet. We can put you on a diet and drop your cholesterol a little bit. But if you're high, it's not going to bring you to the low value. You're still going to be high, just a bit higher than everyone else. So what that proves is the diet heart hypothesis is false. Because in these populations that he was studying, he claimed that if they were eating a lower fat diet, they had less heart disease, but that's very dubious anyway. But it wasn't because the cholesterol had been lowered by the diet, because there was no relationship. So therefore, if it is true what he was saying, something other than diet was explaining the lower heart disease rates in the populations. So therefore, the diet heart hypothesis is false. So that's part of the evidence. Now, what happened in the Framingham study was that when they discovered that diet was unrelated to either heart disease rates or blood cholesterol concentrations, they hid the data. They literally hid the data. They went and buried them in one of the vaults in the National Institute of Health in Washington, D.C. They hid them because they knew that the theory was dead. Now, in the lectures, I also give 3 other studies where they've recovered the data which were hidden. The data were hidden. And the one was the Minnesota coronary experiment, and the other was the Sydney diet heart study. Both studies, when they first were published, the author said, oh, there was no difference. But when people went back on them, they showed there were massive differences. And the people eating the polyunsaturated fats did worse. And the third important study is the Women's Health Initiative, which I was able to expose as fraudulent, because that study also showed that if you had heart disease at the start of the trial and you ate more unsaturated fats, so you replaced the saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, your mortality went up about 25%. And the authors of that paper hid that data, they effectively hid it. And I was able to expose it. And in that same study, they showed that if you had diabetes and you went on this low-fat, healthy, prudent, low-fat diet, your diabetes worsened. But they hid that as well. So we now have 3 studies showing that if you take saturated fat out of the diet and replace it with polyunsaturated fats, you do harm. And therefore, it's unethical for any clinician to tell a patient on the basis of current evidence to replace saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats. And then to come back to your question and your follow-up, taking the statin is much more likely to do him harm than good in the long term.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's just so distressing the way rampantly statins is being still used, and in whichever patients who try to seek out my advice, the moment I ask them to, and ghee, ghee has been such a native Indian thing, and most of our parents and our ancestors used to thrive on ghee, and then this whole Ansel Keys story came in, and we all moved to the polyunsaturated refined oils, and a whole generation of ill health started from Alzheimer's to diabetes to dementia to you name it. And it's the most scary thing, Professor Noakes, for me today is the way our children are suffering. Well, my father is a senior citizen now, but what about our children who are suffering because they are just having the trifecta of the refined oils, the carbohydrates, and the sugar. And when they are at fatty liver, all of this is so much on a rise, and even our younger population. And it's just so tragic. And when they go to see a doctor, they are again and again just told to take a hypocaloric diet, of course, eat some complex carbs, zero fat, and exercise more. And that's what diligently they are trying to do. It's not that they're trying to do, but it just explodes back on them in such a dimension, and they are clueless as to what they should do about it. It's just so tragic. And even if pregnant women, I mean, I've been seeing all this low fat. What is your opinion on that? I feel that in pregnancy, it's going to harm the fetus in a pretty much big way. And maybe that is, I don't know, it's just my insights and my thoughts on it and whatever I have read, that maybe this is the reason for the high rise of autism, ADHD, all sorts of things we are seeing in our children, which we never heard of before. Maybe this whole generation who has been raised on a low fat, zero fat, high carb, just take refined oils kind of a diet. And I don't know. I mean, what is your opinion about that? That is it might be a cause?
No, it is. It's not even a question. Because, if you look at the literature, and of course I had to do this for my trial because I was promoting the high-fat diet for the weaning. And it's very clear that if you look at populations, be it India or in Africa and Asia, wherever, the populations that are eating more protein are doing better. And whenever you introduce protein into these communities who eat mainly carbohydrates and wean onto carbohydrates, they do better. The evidence is absolutely abundantly clear. And historically, of course, the evidence is just as clear that these very healthy populations always used to eat high-fat diets and wean their children. I was lucky because I was born in Zimbabwe, in Rhodesia, in 1949, and my mother had come from a business that sold meat. Her father was a meat exporter from Liverpool, and he used to provide meat to all the boats that went between Liverpool and New York. Unfortunately, in the 1950s, the airplanes came along, and so the industry failed. But my mother was a great believer in high protein diets, and she weaned me onto a high fat diet, and we ate offal and everything, liver and so on. And I ended up quite tall, and most of the Rhodesians I knew, or the Zimbabweans, we tended to be a bit taller. And I notice now when I look around, the generations are getting smaller. They're getting less tall.
Yes.
So when I look at university students at the University of Cape Town, they're smaller, and of course they're fatter, but they're smaller than they used to be. And it seems worse amongst the girls. I don't know what that might mean. But you're absolutely right. If you feed people carbohydrates from day one and wean them on it, they're going to be smaller and fatter. And interestingly, in the trial, when I did discover that the dietary guidelines, they actually say for the first 2 years of your life, you must eat a high-fat diet, but then 2 years and 1 day, you must stop eating fat. Isn't that amazing? On just 1 day, you get 1 day older, now you must stop eating all fat, because now you're going to get premature heart disease at the age of 2 years old if you eat a high-fat diet. I mean, it is just absolutely ludicrous. And in our book, Marika and I describe at length that we once were healthy. And we were very healthy when we were eating high-fat diets. And the Indian story is really interesting. And I looked at this guy, McCarrison, who in about 1910, he was a nutrition scientist. And his boss said to him, listen, if you really want to understand nutrition, you've got to go and live in India. And he went to India and he studied the diets of all the different Indian populations or subgroups in the different areas of India. And he wrote his books about that. And he found that the healthiest were in the far north. And again, you're the expert, not me. But in the far north, the Indians were eating more meat
Yes.
and more ghee and more fat,
Absolutely.
and they were the healthiest. And the further south you came, the more rice and wheat that there was being eaten,
Absolutely.
and the less healthy were the Indian populations. So there it was on a grand scale, an experiment about what's beneficial to the human population.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would like to definitely say here that I belong to the extreme north. I belong from Kashmir. And
Yes.
I actually now when I was just thinking, and this whole thing was coming in my mind, that maybe till the age of 10 or 12, when I was just about 10, we were eating the high fat and the high protein, the typical the upper north where the Kashmiris belong, that kind of a diet. And suddenly this whole concept came in of the high carb. And I think that is when that whole, I started becoming an obese teenager and then an obese youngster, because the protein and the fat was taken away from my diet, and it was all, it all came to be the carbs. And I think that is so true about about India. And yes, we used to be having good quality ghee, and the North Indians were having their high protein diet, and people were doing pretty much well. I don't remember any of my grandfathers or great grandfathers ever having a heart condition at all.
Exactly.
They lived
Exactly.
to be pretty much healthy lives. And this is now when it comes to insulin resistance, I have seen many of your tweets stating very interesting and unusual signs of insulin resistance, and some of them were actually an eye opener to me as well. So could you tell our audience here which is the most unusual sign of insulin resistance, and something which we would just overlook if we have it, and yet we should then be very careful about it?
Well, I think one is tinnitus. And, I've always had tinnitus for as long as I can remember. So that's
Yes.
one. The other is the dark skin on the back of the neck or on the front of the neck. And the other skin tags. My dad used to have skin tags. And of course, I didn't know what they were. But he was obviously insulin resistant and diabetic. So those are three. But yeah, I think the marking on the skin and the dark rings under the eyes, not sure if that's related. You would know.
Yes.
But those were some of the factors that I think you need to look for.
But tinnitus was something which was very new to me as well. And then when I cast my mind back about so many people who complained of tinnitus, and it's again become a pretty much common problem in our country of tinnitus. And I definitely, if next time somebody comes up to me with this problem, I'll ask them to maybe get their fasting insulin checked, or just lower their carbohydrates. They would perform so well on that only. And this is something which has been, most of the athletes have asked me to ask this very pertinent question: is when you speak of a high fat, when you talk of the word LCHF, what does it really mean? Does it mean how much should be the protein and the fat for an athlete? And what about the role of exogenous ketones? Because there is a whole debate over exogenous ketones, whether the athletes should take them in their diet, should they not? Or a high fat means that they literally have to eat a lot of fat, or it comes to the kind of fat which we are eating, I am eating, and most of you are eating, is the fatty cuts of meat and the eggs, and the fat comes from the food itself. So that's a whole controversial topic, and people are very confused. People are actually now pouring ghee and adding butter to everything and having their bulletproof proof coffees, and people who are needing to lose weight aren't. And so what is your insight on that?
Yeah, I think that's another great question. Most of us just eat to taste. And so we eat, and as soon as we're full, we stop eating. And that's the way I've used it. And the experiments or the studies that have been done show that people actually don't increase their fat consumption. They simply replace the source of fats. Because when you're eating a lot of junk food, you get a lot of fat as shortening in baked foods, which you don't recognize. And you cut all of those out so that immediately you go to a low fat diet. The reality is the total calories from fat probably stay pretty much the same. But because we all reduce our calorie consumption, And certainly in my case, I probably dropped by a third. So if you're eating the same number of calories of fat, but you've reduced total calories, then the percentage of fat's going to go up. So the reality is that we probably don't eat all that much more fat. My good friend Ted Naiman, and I'm sure you've come across him, he believes that we've got to eat more protein and focus on the protein and eat protein foods that are full of protein and full of nutrients. And if you want to lose weight, you've got to do that, and that will reduce your fat consumption, because he's quite correct that the fat around your body is coming directly from what you eat. It's stored directly in your fat cells, and of course it's made. The reason why the diet works is you get your insulin down, and then you can burn that fat. But if you're eating too many calories, then you're going to keep storing it as fat, and so you're not going to lose weight. And he suggests that you should focus on the protein. And I've definitely increased my protein consumption, but the only problem is protein I don't find as satiating as I do fat. So it's a big balance that you have to strike. Because if you're not satiated, you'll eat more calories, and so therefore potentially you're not going to lose weight. But if you eat more fat, you're not going to also lose weight. So I think you just have to find what's best for you. And I don't think, counting and working out that you're eating whatever 70% of as calories as fat is what you need to worry about. I think
it's actually become sometimes very difficult for us to advocate people as to what to eat, because primarily Indians can, I don't think, ever be on a ketogenic diet, because most of our sources of protein are lentils, legumes, though Dr. Ted Naiman definitely advocates for usage of processed food in the form of whey protein, and I myself have seen it does help with vegetarians, because there are so many vegetarians who are not even taking eggs, and so many are actually sometimes allergic to dairy. Then what do you give them? It becomes quite a battle of wits. So, but what about exogenous ketones? There was suddenly a huge topic about the MCT oils, and all the athletes were adding MCT oils, and they were saying that it like really works. I did try them out. It never worked with me. In fact, I always landed up with stomach cramps and just feeling a bit queasy. I completely stopped them. Some MCT oils bottles are still lying in my kitchen. What is your opinion when we are going on a long distance run? Would you advise us to take exogenous ketones?
No, I wouldn't. But let me tell you this: that one of the ladies who have developed them is well known to me, and I visited her in San Francisco, and she gave me a tumbleful of them to take. And it dropped my glucose dramatically, and my ketones went from 0.3 to 3 in half an hour. It was astonishing. So it's an incredibly powerful medicine, I think. And that's probably where its role will come. Because it may well be more powerful than metformin and other drugs for lowering your glucose. So I can see it as a medical intervention, but it's very costly. And again, it's based on the theory that the reason why you slow down during exercise is you've not got enough energy or fuel. That's nonsense. There's so much fuel in the blood system that you don't need to add something else to it. And I think that people will be disappointed that the ketones in the end won't have a really big effect. But I think they have a real role in treating people who are seriously ill.
Oh, okay. That's something I will definitely read about. That sounds to be something really interesting, and it's worth an experiment. And when it again comes to long distance running, your whole their whole book and the theory about exercise-induced hyponatremia, and how we are all told to continuously keep drinking. I myself still have the habit of drinking a lot of water, which I know it doesn't really work. So I would just like to know more about this. It's just so fascinating.
Humans evolved from creatures that have been evolving for millions of years, billions of years, I should say. And we had to get these things sorted out. You didn't have to have this huge brain to work out what you should be eating and how you should be drinking. So you never tell your cat or your dog or your horse or the lions or the tigers or the leopards, you don't tell them how much they have to eat and how much they have to drink. And they do perfectly well. But it's only once you're a human, you're so stupid that you don't know when you should be drinking. So the industry came along and said that we had to sell more product. And the only way we could do that was by telling people that they must drink more. And in my book, Waterlogged, which is a 30-year dissertation on this problem, I worked out that what happened was the industry got the scientists to say that if you lost any fluids, you'd become dehydrated and you would die of heat stroke within minutes. And the reason they did that was because they wanted to make sure that their sports drinks were drunk by people going to the gym for 5 minutes, because that's the market. The market is not marathon runners. There are too few of them. But the number of people going to gyms and exercising outside. And so, you know, when I run outside, I inevitably see someone carrying a bottle with them. And I think, you know, what are you doing? You're barely walking and you need water. And they were so successful that they managed to drive the sales of their products. And that introduced this overdrinking theory. And I can tell you, we did experiments early on, and we could never find that doing anything but drinking to thirst was optimum. And I've interviewed some of the world's best athletes, and world records in the marathon have been set by people who didn't drink during the race. Haile Gebrselassie ran a 2:06 marathon. I think that was his time. He lost 10 pounds, 5 kilograms during the race. So, and people would say, oh, you must have died. Well, actually, no, because he was carrying 10 pounds less. So no wonder he was flying at the finish, because he was so light. And that people don't forget that. And in the laboratory, it's extremely difficult to recreate the conditions. What's the benefit of losing 10 pounds in a race? It's very difficult to calculate the benefit of that. And so we were just told, well, losing 10 pounds, you're so dehydrated, it's a problem. It's not true. The humans are naturally overhydrated. We've got a lot of fluid in the gut. And when you start to lose water, you take that water out first of all. So it's an excess fluid that you don't need. And so we've done plenty of experiments showing that you can lose 3-4 kilograms of water and you're not dehydrated, because you found the water from other areas. And the water stored with the glycogen when you start exercise. So people should just drink to thirst, and then they will do fine.
Absolutely. And what would you be your advice to recreational runners, people like me who would maybe just be running just for our health and for the happiness of running? Should we also not carry along any, I mean, I don't have any of the sugary sports drinks, but what about salt solutions? Are they not really advocated?
No, you don't need them, because the body, again, copes very well. We're all in a salt excess, a state of salt excess, and we're excreting salt all the time. And that's why urine has lots of salt in it, and sweat has lots of salt in it. Mm-hmm. And what the industry did was said, oh, you see, you're losing so much salt in your sweat. It's because you're salt deficient, or you're going to become salt deficient. And that's nonsense. If you're salt deficient, you have no salt in your urine and you have no salt in your sweat. As long as you've got salt in the sweat and salt in the urine, you've got a salt excess. Mm-hmm. So that was, it's never going to be an issue. Mm-hmm. We're excreting the excess salt all the time. And in the book, I discussed some of the experiments that were done in the 1940s, mm-hmm. where they took military conscripts who didn't want to fight the war. And so these guys volunteered, and they did experiments you could never do today. They exercised them for 6 hours a day in extreme heat in these environmental chambers. Mm-hmm. And they gave them reducing amounts of salt. And even at 2 grams a day, which is a low intake, they couldn't induce salt deficiency, because the body conserves salt so effectively. Mm-hmm. So you'll never run out of salt. It's not going to happen.
That's something which is really interesting, because that I will definitely try. Even if it's like the kind of humid weather we are facing, I'll definitely try to go ahead with this, because that's something which is something really new. And I have been reading about it, but sometimes it does, you know, this is something which I have to imbibe, as to go for a long run without carrying anything with me. It would be quite liberating, actually. And it's really been wonderful discussing such interesting topics with you. And I do wish that people would just understand that, as in one of your YouTubes, you have said it's insulin resistance, stupid. So it's, I think the bottom of what, so the take home message at the bottom of the most of the lifestyle problems and the poor metabolic health, would you really say that it's the insulin's resistance and it's the high carbohydrate intake that we are taking this whole generation? Do you really, I mean, would this be one of your key messages for today?
I didn't hear all you said, but I gather it's about eating high carbohydrate diets. And yes,
no, I said, would you like to say this, that most of the lifestyle problems or diseases which we are having these days, and the metabolic poor health, is it all about underlying insulin resistance and the various factors linked with it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's the main factors. You know, I'm beginning to realize that polyunsaturated fats are also a problem.
Yes.
And we've underestimated their importance of them as well.
Absolutely.
And it's because we've been so brainwashed to believe that it's a saturated fat that we haven't taken the polyunsaturated fat seriously.
Absolutely.
And I think that the evidence will slowly accumulate. Now people will start looking more into polyunsaturated fats. There's really only been one person, Fred Kummerow, who ever really took seriously the problems of polyunsaturated fats and trans fats. And no one really followed him because there's no money in researching it. So
absolutely,
that's the problem.
Absolutely. For Indians who are predominantly a vegetarian society, what would you like to say to them? How could they increase their fat and their proteins without really going on that high carb diet? Dairy, would you think, is the best option?
Yeah, definitely. And avocado. I don't know if coconut oil is available.
Coconut oil is available, yes.
Yeah, I think dairy is an important point. So anyway, I was looking through Marika and my book because I had to give you this one story on page 325. We mentioned McCarrison. And by the way, I must just mention that one of the people who saved my life, together with Marika, was Dr. Rocky Ramdas, who was my chief lawyer. And we are brothers. And of course, he's of Indian extraction. And we've had just an amazing time together. We loved the friendship that we developed. And it's continued afterwards. And I'm helping with his other work. And we are just like this. And that if I got one thing out of this trial, it was my friendship with Rocky. And he's, of course, told me all about the Indian philosophies. And Ganushi, is it? Yeah. So I have my little elephant at which he gave to me. And I forget, he's the guy who comforts you. And he said, that's the person we need. Anyway, in that light, and please understand
which page is this?
Oh, on page 325. And please understand, I didn't write this, but it may be of interest to Indian people who want to study the history of nutrition in the country. And this is McCarrison, who'd spent his life studying the Indian diet. And he said, indeed, nothing could be more striking than the contrast between the manly, stalwart, and resolute races of the north, the Pathans, the Baluchis, the Sikhs, the Punjabis, the Rajputs, and the Maharathas. And then he talks about other population. He doesn't use some very general, it's not a very generous statement. I'm not going to read them out.
Yes, I have seen that.
So he recognized that, eating meat was important to the Indian population.
So this is the only thing I can tell to the vegetarian population here, that at least if possible, they can start adding eggs to their diet. And eggs, with the poor, extremely nutritionally great eggs have earned such a disrepute thanks to the egg yolks and the cholesterol. I don't know how many of us have been responsible for throwing away tons and tons of egg yolks. With again all the big food companies coming in with the bottled egg whites and all sorts of things, and we fail to understand the kind of micronutrients and all the good quality nutrition which is in the egg yolks, and it's just caused us so much of issues. And when it comes to dairy, would you like, what do you really think should be try to spread the message? Is the full fat milk more relevant, or would you just say to let's just have the cottage cheese, or that's the cottage cheese, the paneer which we take out? What would you feel would be a better source of protein for the vegetarians?
Yeah, I don't think milk's not so great, but if you've got an insulin resistant problem, because it's full of carbohydrates.
Exactly.
And so I think that you've got to worry about that a bit.
Exactly.
So I would prefer that you ate cream and other dairy produce like cheese. I think that would be better. Milk is full of carbohydrates.
Full of carbohydrates.
If you want to treat your diabetes, you can't really drink milk. It's got too much carbohydrate in it.
Absolutely. I completely agree with what you're saying here, and I think it's just been so wonderful interacting with you, and I will try to digitize this whole of course. Pratik is my backhand support who's selflessly doing all this to spread health awareness in India, and we'll try to digitize this, put it on YouTube, share the link with you, share the link with Marika, and try to promote it as much as possible. Because the one thing which Corona has taught us, that if we would all be sitting on good metabolic health, I doubt if that our whole universe would be in such a state of economic, financial, social, all sorts of shambles, just thanks to the fact that poor metabolic health and vitamin D. And I just wish to spread this message. It's so distressing to me when I still see youngsters roaming around with the junk food, packaged food in their hands. When I see all those huge WhatsApp discussions where first everything about Corona is discussed, and then somebody will post one message that is Domino's open now, is Pizza Hut delivering pizzas, and I'm like, oh my God, after all this discussion, we are back to the junk food. I do wish that we go back to eating clean, eating healthy. And it is so surprising, Professor Noakes and Marika, that so many of people, of parents who are trying to eat healthy would be giving all sorts of junk food to their children, because according to them, the child can eat whatever junk, because after all, it's a child, And well, we are trying to eat clean, and that just completely fails to... it amazes me all the time that why are we doing this? Knowingly, we are feeding the child. Yes, Marika would like to...
Let Marika answer that one.
Yes, sorry, two things. I think it's very important to remind people all over the world that carbohydrate is not an essential nutrient.
Yes.
So that you don't need to get it exogenously outside the body from foods. You may like them, you may want them, that's a very different issue. But when it comes to actually needing it, the body can get all the carbohydrate, the glucose it needs from protein and
Yes.
And even fat, from gluconeogenesis.
Gluconeogenesis.
And also parents, as parents and grandparents, we need to start feeding our children correctly and not telling them that we're giving them treats.
Yes.
And I'm as guilty as that when I am with my beloved grandchildren. And I now, when I buy them chocolate, I hate to say that I do, but I say to them, I'm not really giving you a treat. Let me remind you that this is actually poisonous, and I'll explain why if you really will listen to me. And I think, the terminology is really, really important, because we are not giving them treats. My favorite quote, one of my favorite sources of health information, along with Professor Noakes, is Dr. David Unwin,
Yes.
a GP in the UK, and he's just a wonderful, wonderful man. And he's fully on board. He was going to stop being a GP because he felt like he really wasn't helping people any longer. And he was telling people, he now tells his patients that to tell diabetics to eat carbs moderately, all it does is it leaves them moderately poisoned. So who on this planet, what kind of doctor or dietitian or nutritionist would want to leave people moderately poisoned? And I'll say no more. I'll get off my hobby horse.
That's something I just admire about you. That's something, that's the warrior spirit in you, you know. And I just completely appreciate this whole honesty. And this is something I keep telling all the people who ask me also, that can we have it in moderation? And I'm like, okay, would you like to have a little bit of poison in moderation every single day? But I'm so glad that, you know, this is straight away coming from Professor Noakes and from you, Marika, because this is going to mean a lot to the Indian community, with so many coaches, so many trainers coming on the scene who are only telling people to and the doctors as well. I mean, it's become a crazy scene. Here we have doctors who are telling the diabetics to moderately eat carbohydrates and to eat complex carbohydrates in the form of some grains, some new grains and all of these things which have come in. And here there are people who are running, gymming, cross-training, CrossFit, and then they have their own gurus and their own mentors who will then tell them to keep eating these gels, these various sports drinks to get that burst of energy. So it's become such a lethal vicious cycle between these two communities, and the general public is just suffering because they don't know what to do. So it's been, and I'm so glad, Marika, that you could just stay on the whole time with us, because, you know, I really wanted you to be there. And Professor Noakes, again, it's a fan moment for you. Marika knows how nervous I was, and my whole family knows, everybody in my family knows how nervous I was, because indeed, I have so much of respect for you, not only for changing the dietary conventions, all of those, but, you know, it takes so much of grit and determination to actually say that I was the one who said have carbohydrates, and now I am the one who's saying that don't have them. It's just, what do I say? I'm at a loss.
Could I say one more thing?
Absolutely,
I've
please.
also been noticing it deeply disturbing how medical doctors and drug industry establishments are reacting to the message that if people just stay metabolically healthy, then perhaps the new coronavirus would not have had, or in future will not have, such a severe effect on people. And nobody really knows at this stage, because there have been no, randomized controlled trials, the so-called gold standard, but it makes sense. And the reaction of industry-led medical doctors and dietitians to that message is completely out of proportion. We should not be shutting down scientific debate. And as a journalist, I get very worried when doctors and scientists try and shut down debate, because then I think, patients should avoid those kind of doctors like the plague, and those scientists as well. But I'm just speaking as a journalist, because, the more debate, the more opinions, the more evidence, the merrier.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I feel it's not rocket science. It just makes so much sense. Why can't people just see this simple logic? Be metabolically healthy, have something your body needs, and that is protein and fat. Incorporate a good source of fitness in your life, and you are good to go. This is such a simple logic. It's so simple. I mean, but after years of reading and reading the kind of the same kind of literature which other doctors have read, I immediately could absorb where I'm going wrong. But I think, I don't know what it is which makes people not accept this glaring truth which is right there on our face. The kind of metabolic, and in India we have a double whammy, because number one, it's like the people like us who are having the carbohydrates only because of our pleasure, and the below poverty zone, who are now, because the good quality protein and the fats have become inaccessible to them because of the less demand. I remember eggs used to be so cheap when I was a child. Even eggs have become so expensive. They are literally living off rice and roti, and they are the people who are actually getting hit by diabetes. I've seen hospitals being full with those diabetic patients getting amputations, losing their vision, having all sorts of ill health, and being on medication. Their families just abandon them in the hospital. And it's just that because if people have stopped having good quality protein and fat, they've become expensive. It's all, the demand and supply chain is all gone for a toss. That's something which is really tragic. Because okay, people like us can still afford treatment if we end up getting diabetes or any of the other metabolic disease, but the poor category people, there's just nothing available for them to eat. It's so tragic. So, well, I guess it will take us quite a while to ultimately get this whole, and we'll need to have laws on it. We need to somehow get the government and the laws framed, and I think it's a huge battle ahead. But I really am so happy to be able to get at least this small thing on board, so that at least the people who will be able to watch it, if there's a small ripple caused in the ocean, that's good enough. As Professor Noakes has done, that ripple effect is going to spread, and maybe the next generation would be, we would be gifting them the gift of health. And I will not, I think, try to exceed beyond the given time, because I know Professor Noakes has been so kind of you to be here. And sir, if there's any last take-home message you would like to give all the people here, what would you like to say to us?
Don't wait until it's too late. I think that's one of the messages we've got,
Absolutely.
That's people delay and delay and delay, and they think they're healthy. And all of a sudden the COVID virus comes along and it takes out the people who are less healthy. Well, you don't have any time. Once the virus comes, you don't have any time to make the corrections.
Absolutely.
But it's only one of the factors. The complications of metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance are so grave that you really need to start working on it. And the beauty is that it's completely controllable. Absolutely. By just eating low carbs, just eating less than 25 grams carbs a day. Absolutely. And you don't have to worry about your insulin resistance. And absolutely, you don't have to worry that you're going to get the complications. It's so simple.
It's so simple.
That's the beauty of it. There's this killing disease, but it's so easy to reverse.
I completely agree with it. And thank you again. And thank you, Marika, for enabling me to connect with Professor Noakes. I'm so honored to be on the part of your website as well. And you just suddenly discovered me from Twitter, and you connected with me. And that's how I could connect with Professor Noakes. I'm really
right here. So we did
be able to connect with you. So, sir, I would not take more of your time. I think I've already exceeded my time. And again, it's huge thanks for being here with me. And I'm just so honored. And as we Indians say, namaste, namaskar, with all my deepest regards and best wishes for you.
Thank you.
And Marika,
thank
so
you.
nice
Thank
to
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Marika.
Thank you.
John.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Thank you. Bye-bye. All the best to everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, Prof.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Fantastic.
Namaskar.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.